Okay, so good morning and welcome to our online webinar, Compliance or Better Practice, Health and Safety in Uncertain Times. My name is Sarah Haffenden and I'm the Marketing Communications Manager at UKZN Extended Learning, also known as UEL. So in case you're unfamiliar with UEL, we are the continuing education unit of the University of KwaZulu-Natal and we offer all the short courses on behalf of the university. So our online learning webinars are offered once a month, so please do take a look at our final slide at the end of this webinar for further details on our next webinar, or you can visit our website at www.ukznextendedlearning.com. So please note that due to the nature of this webinar, we will not be able to address raised hands and questions throughout the presentation. So please would you post all comments and questions in the Q&A box, and these will be addressed at the end of the webinar. If you have any technical issues, you can also post that in the chat forum. So we'll also allow for live questions at the end. If you have a question you would like to ask Prof live, you can just raise your hand and we'll open up your mic and you can ask your question live. So I'd now like to introduce you to our guest speaker for today, Professor Theo Hoff. Professor Hoff has been involved in health and safety practice and research for several years, with a PhD from the United States focusing on alternative approaches to the management of health and safety on construction sites. He has published extensively and delivered several papers on the subject in national and international journals and conferences. He regularly reviews papers on health and safety and construction industry development issues for a range of internationally acclaimed journals and serves on several editorial boards. Professor Hoff has co-authored chapters on health and safety in a number of books, and he is heavily involved in the International Council for Research and Innovation in Building and Construction Work Commission, which focuses on health and safety in construction. So welcome, Prof. Hoff, and over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. I hope that you are all safe and healthy on day 201 of lockdown level 1. As Sarah has indicated, I'm going to talk about compliance or better practice, health and safety in uncertain times. And just a little bit about me before people say that I'm purely an academic. I've worked in the construction industry for more than 15 years. Currently, I'm the research professor at Mangosuthu University of Technology in the Faculty of Engineering. I earned a PhD at the University of Florida in the USA. And as previously stated, I focused on construction health and safety. I've edited 2 books, one published in the US and one published in the Netherlands on construction health and safety, and just completed a comprehensive handbook on the management of safety, health, and the environment in South Africa, which is about to be published. I'm about halfway through a second book entitled Introduction to Construction Health and Safety. I'd also like to take this opportunity immediately to inform you that if you want to know anything more about health and safety, construction health and safety, stay in touch with Extended Learning at UKZN because there are a number of courses that are coming up, one starting this month and the others probably starting in November. So I encourage you to register and sign up for those. So before we get into the actual presentation, I think it's important to confirm that in terms of our Constitution, which is a supreme law of our country, under the Bill of Rights, everyone has the right to an environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being. And therefore, by implication, a major responsibility is placed on employers to create such an environment for all their workers. Sarah will poll your responses to this question by way of introduction is, do you always buckle up? And I'll pause for a few seconds just to give you an opportunity to respond to that. The next two slides will also require you to respond to them. It'll be interesting to see how honest you can be in responding.
We have about 91% voted. So I'm going to give 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to share the results.
Okay, 97% of those who participated, you do always buckle up. In fact, I buckle up before I pull my vehicle out of my garage. My wife thinks I'm crazy. But it is the right thing to do. In other surveys I've done, I found that on average between 67 and 70% of participants actually admit to doing this regularly. However, if you do not, then you know the consequences. And in fact, you've broken the law and you have therefore not complied. The second question, again, we'd like honest responses.
You've got 86% have voted. 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey, we got 100% for the first time.
So 100%, okay, and 26% text while driving, okay? So if you've done that, then you have also, in fact, broken the law. So you've been non-compliant. Okay. The reality, in fact, is that texting while driving increases risk 23 times. And there are devices available to assist you to respond to phone calls, but not necessarily to actually text. The final question that I would like you to respond to is, do you always use your speedometer? If it's working, of course, which it should be.
Okay, 92% have voted. So I'm going to have 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We had 94% voted.
Okay, great. Do you know you can use your speedometer for many purposes other than just monitoring your speed? I'm just concerned about the 40% who say that they do not always use it. But thank you for participating and thank you for your responses. So compliance, as we can see, is a challenge. Okay, and not to forget that you actually broke the law if you didn't use your speedometer. So what does this particular sign mean? It actually means that 120 kilometers per hour is the maximum speed that you are permitted to travel at on this particular stretch of road, and your speed might be monitored via a camera. On this road, the maximum speed limit is still 120. It's a freeway or a highway. If you travel at 120, you would be complying. However, if you actually did that, you would be endangering not only your life, but also the life of others. So it's definitely not better practice. Even though you are allowed to do so, it would not be breaking a law per se. So then, if we say we are complying or we are compliant, what are we actually saying? Compliance is referred to as conforming to a rule, which could be a rule in your company, a law, an act of parliament, a regulation, a specification, maybe a company policy, or even an industry standard. The question though is, what if there were none of those? There were no rules, no acts of parliament dealing with HNS, no regulations, no standards. What would we do then? Paul Nash, who sits on the Industry Safety Steering Group in the UK, and he made this statement in a major report that was released, and he said, the underlying message we're getting back from industry is that people will not change unless there is legislation forcing them to do so, basically reinforcing the demand for a compliance paradigm. The question though is, can you actually legislate change? We've seen that from the polls that we've done, where we should have had 100% complying, but we didn't have that even amongst our own audience. When we say compliance with laws, we need to know which laws. And I've just put a sample here of 6 laws, and there are many, many others. So if you say you're compliant with law, law-abiding citizen, you are saying you're complying with the Constitution, the OSH Act, COID, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Labor Relations Act, Skills Development Act, and many, many others. When we say we're also compliant, we are suggesting that we are complying with all kinds of regulations. And this is just a sample of some of the regulations that we would have to comply with if that is what we claim. And you can see the list is fairly comprehensive. And I have not listed every possible regulation that might cover your particular industry. So stating that you're complying has far-reaching implications for the person claiming or the organization claiming to do so. Let me point out to you, though, that all legislation and regulations are minimum requirements under ideal or stable conditions. So in other words, when those conditions change, we need to think about what we need to do to comply. I argue that compliance, therefore, amounts to doing the bare minimum necessary to avoid defaulting or breaking the law. Question, therefore, is compliance then enough to improve health and safety performance? And all the evidence that I've seen to date suggests that it is probably not. So just to give you some idea of some of the features of compliance, and they'll all appear, we'll just touch on them. They're prescriptive, they describe how we need to do things. It's easy to see whether someone is actually compliant, it's visible. It's like a recipe, you deviate from the recipe and the result is not as shown on the picture. It has to be continually amended, and we've seen that happening with this current pandemic. It is backed by monitoring, so your inspectors will come and see that you're actually complying. It's inflexible because the laws take a long time to change. Easy to work with because you know exactly what you need to do to comply. Unfortunately, it doesn't take into account the fact that work processes actually change, and some of what has been prescribed does not necessarily apply or is difficult to comply with. On the other hand, better practice has a different focus. It is performance-oriented. It describes what has to be achieved, looks at the end results. It's flexible and adaptable. So you don't have to wait for laws and regulations to change. It's results and targets oriented. It fosters innovation. So when something changes, you don't have to change any regulations to comply with. It goes above and beyond the minimum requirements. It is harder to work with, especially if you have an inspector that wants to see whether you've complied and they don't fully understand the operations and the reason why you have adopted the particular practice that you have. I've been asked, why do I use the term better practice instead of best practice. And my mind goes back to when I was at school, and this is what we had to recite. We had to say good, better, best, never, never rest until your good is better and your better best. What that suggests, though, is that when we say that what we have is the best, and just by the way, I'm a Liverpool supporter, and that's a claim I would like to make. It therefore implies that there's no more room for any further improvement because you've reached the ultimate, the best. And that is why I prefer using the term better practice, because there's always an opportunity to improve and strive to get to the optimum performance that you want. So just some examples I thought of presenting to you relative to compliance, and then suggesting what could be better practice. We all know in terms of the Act that we need to have health and safety representatives, and I have my own views on that, but that's for another time to discuss. Where in fact, if you have less than 20 employees, you do not need to have health and safety representatives, and therefore would actually be complying. However, if one understands what health and safety representatives actually do, then it's foolhardy not to have them. So better practice would be that we would have health and safety representatives irrespective of the number of employees that we actually employ, and maybe even more than what is prescribed. A similar example would be health and safety committees, and the law requires you to have a health and safety committee in your organization if you have more than 2 health and safety representatives. So if you have 1, you would be compliant by not having a health and safety committee. Again, think about why a health and safety committee is important, and better practice would be to have a health and safety committee irrespective of how many health and safety representatives the organization has. Another one refers to the safe work procedures or safe operating procedures in organizations. You would be complying if you had those, and you had them in a very pretty file that you kept in your office, so that when an inspector from the Department of Labor visited you, you could actually produce those and show them to them. Better practice would be to have those, plus to place those SWPs or SOPs in the hands of the workers who are engaged directly in the working activity at the place where they are actually executing it. That would be better practice. A very contentious one in the construction sector is a requirement to have a health and safety file. Now, there is confusion about what this actually is and why one should have it. And it is possible to actually purchase one from a consultant without any reference to a particular project. Now, to me, that is like going into CNA and purchasing a generic manual for my motor car. Better practice would actually be to have 2 files. One would be for the management of health and safety and for record keeping on a project, but also bearing in mind that you would need to hand over a health and safety file to the client or the owner of that facility. Much like a manual that you'd find in your motor car. You would find a Mercedes, whatever the model is, there'd be a handbook there that tells you everything about the vehicle. This particular file, the purpose thereof is supposed to be to assist the owner to manage or maintain the facility, or if should they want to do any alterations, that there is information in that file that they can refer to be able to do that satisfactorily. Now, building inspectors don't, or labor inspectors do not even know what an Hns file is. So there's an area, compliant, you have a file, better practice, understanding why you actually have it and what its purpose is. And the last one that I thought we'd just touch on is the Hns Policy Statement. And I'm sure that if you had to walk around in your organization and actually ask the workers or employees what the Hns Policy Statement of the organization is, I would bet you that they would not be able to tell you. Or at least most of them would not be able to tell you. Reason being that these are statements that are maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 pages long. Better practice would actually be for you to have that policy statement short enough, like on the back of a business card, so that every single worker can actually memorize it and you can actually ask them and they would be able to tell you what the Hns policy statement is for that organization. The World Economic Forum had a survey in 2017 to 2018, and they identified 5 risks, and you can see them listed there. The old weapons of mass destruction, weather events, natural disasters, such as floods, etc., climate change, and water crises. And we know how badly wrong they were. We have now seen an unseen, unwelcome, an enemy, the coronavirus, which was never thought of even in that particular survey. In terms of the COVID-19 protocols, which are listed, some of them, you know them all, and you should actually be adhering to them, unlike the US president. I'm not going to repeat them, you know them. And these are some of the minimum ones that one needs to comply with. And these are covered in terms of Section 27.2, regulations under Disaster Management Act. And these are changed from time to time depending on the level of lockdown that we are in. So if you did that, you would be complying, again, with minimum requirements. However, I've posted a few things to think about in terms of compliance. So are those steps that you've just referred to enough to prevent the spread of the virus? And that's causing lots of uncertainty in the minds of employees, the general public, as well as employers. And we are now being warned of a second wave, and we've seen that starting to happen. So complying with those steps, is it enough to prevent the spread of the virus? There's also a need for a COVID-19 coordinator. Again, what are the qualifications required of such a person? What is the knowledge, skill set that this person needs to have, because the responsibilities are quite onerous. Someone discussed this particular issue with me, and so what if a worker has asthma and wearing the employer provided cloth mask all day actually makes them sick? And the question was, if they had to come to work, would the employer provide them with a special mask which would not make them ill at all? The employer might say those are expensive and unfortunately we can't afford them. So another question. A major one is, how will the difference be handled between COVID-19 protocols at work and the lack thereof when workers actually leave and go home where social distancing is impractical? So how are we going to monitor that when they come back to work the next day? How long is the period between contact and having symptoms before being detected at screening and access points? You know the story with the US president, a lot of debate and discussion around that. We don't know. How reliable then would temperature screening be, which is what we tend to rely on when we control access to our workspaces? What about thoughts that do not allow for social distancing in the workplace? How do we deal with those? How will working in confined spaces be managed? If you want to reduce the possibilities of and slow down the rate of infection, should we consider the number of workers that are at work at any given time? What do we do about those then who are not at work? Do they still get paid? If we worked in shifts in our particular sectors, would that help? What if a worker self-isolates for 10 days and does not have sufficient sick leave? Are they going to be penalized for that? Will workers underreport morbidities, those that have got pre-existing conditions and they've been listed? How should workers with comorbidities be managed in the workplace? I think what brings the big question is, how will labor conditions and employment contracts be affected, to take all of these into account? And what happens when a company has a health promotion or a medical surveillance program in place? Do they put that aside and focus only on COVID-19 because it will absorb most of their resources? And where does the responsibility of the employer start and end? So indeed, food for thought: compliance or better practice? We all are aware of the fourth industrial revolution, and there's been a lot of spoken about it. The fact that we are even using this technology is evidence of the changing world. But there are a number of innovations that are going to affect the way we do business, the way we carry out our operations, where we work, in terms of mobile devices, Internet of Things platforms, location detection technologies, drones, 3D printing, a host of different challenging technologies that we will soon see emerge in our workplaces. How do we deal with the health and safety challenges of those? So that particular device, if I can call it that, was developed in Australia. And should that be introduced into South Africa, it would have far-reaching implications for a host of issues and create a lot of uncertainty in how we implement those kinds of technologies in our workplaces. So regulations, laws, standards, specifications would need to change so that we know what we need to comply with if that's what we're going to go and persist in as our paradigm. But bear in mind what the Constitution requires of us as employers for all our workers. So what is compliance and what is better practice? I believe that what we've seen is better practice, but we have to take the context into account. One theme that runs throughout the work of the ISSG in the UK, which I referred to earlier, and this is coming from the report, is the need for culture change in industry. While some parts of industry are making real progress, too many are waiting for legislation before acting. Now, there's no regulations, we will do nothing. One of the statements in that report says, don't wait for legislation to make the change that are necessary now to ensure that we never have another tragedy. And this was in relation to the Grenfell project, which made the headlines of the news for a long time when they had those fires and many people were affected and died. So the question then is, how do we fix this? How do we introduce this culture change? How do we move away from waiting for legislation? Before I address that, which is the last segment of this webinar, two particular concepts need to be mentioned. That is culture and climate. The health and safety culture, which is defined as the value placed on the health and safety of the workforce through policies, procedures, and practices in an organization. And on the other hand, you've got the health and safety climate, which is an indicator, like a thermometer or barometer, of the overall nature and strength of the shared organizational health and safety culture. So if we want to know what the health and safety culture in an organization is, we can start by actually measuring the health and safety climate within that organization. And that would give us a very good indicator of what the health and safety culture is and what would need to change. We are currently developing a tool we call it the SASH-CAT tool, the South African Safety and Health Climate Assessment Tool. And we have been working with the CPWR in the US, now called the Center for Construction Research and Training, can be used in any industry. They used to be the Center to Protect Workers' Rights. I must point out that the focus of this tool is on better practice. And we use 9 leading indicators. There are, at this stage, a total of 43 items in the tool, and we measure 5 possible levels of maturity relative to each of these 9 indicators. And then we use 5 time frame options to measure the commitment of the organization to adopt items within each indicator. And then we can use the tool to calculate a rating, which is indicative of the HNS culture, and a detailed report can then be generated. So what are the leading indicators that make up this particular tool that we are developing? There are 9 of them: demonstrating management commitment and involvement, aligning and integrating health and safety as a value, not a priority, into the business, ensuring responsibility and accountability at all levels, improving supervisor leadership, empowering, involving, and engaging workers, improving communication, training at all levels of the organization, and we encourage client or owner involvement. And then the indicator that we particularly think is relevant is the last one, responsive emergency and disaster management. So I spoke about a maturity scale relative to each of the indicators. So, and they run from 1 to 5. So 1 we call ad hoc, in other words, we just do things when we need to. 3, reactive. 2, 3, compliant. 4, proactive. And 5 is better practice. And obviously we want to strive to move from 1 to 5 across all the indicators. And I argue that most of our organizations in South Africa would probably be between 1 and 3, with a few exceptions higher up. In terms of the level of commitment, I indicated that there would be 5 levels. We would rate it a 1 if it was currently being implemented. 2, within short term, within the next 1 to 2 months. 3, medium term, if it is envisaged to do that within the next 6 to 12 months, realizing that you can't implement everything instantaneously. Long-term implementation between 1 to 2 years would be 4, and we rate no implementation as 5. So an example of using this, just looking at one particular indicator demonstrating management, commitment, and involvement. And we've listed 6 indicators there. You could obviously have a lot more, but those are the ones that we decided to look at. So management demonstrates commitment and involvement by being present and visible in the workplace. 2, always reflecting good Hns practices in the workplace. This is management. Allocating resources, actively participating in meetings and forums, striving for 0 injuries, and obviously reviewing and correcting anything that needs to be attended to. So this is how we would apply this. Along the top of the table, you will see the 5 maturity scales from ad hoc to better practice, and obviously the arrows indicate where we want to go. So in terms of factor indicator being present and visible in the workplace, we have developed some climate maturity descriptors. For example, management rarely visits the actual workplace, is ad hoc, and all the way through where, for example, under compliant, management only visits the workplace when required or makes infrequent visits. And the ultimate is that management frequently visits the workplace and interacts with workers. And then if we look at the second one, always reflecting good Hns practices in the workplace, again, running from ad hoc to better practice, where management typically acts as a poor health and safety role model by themselves, breaking the policies and procedures all the way across, whereas being compliant, they manage strictly conformity to the act and policies and procedures, never more or never less. And then finally, right on the far end where we actually want to be, that management consistently models Hns conduct above and beyond what is required and actually recognizes workers who do the same. So let's, for example, say that in the organization we're looking at, we find that being present and visible in the workplace is reactive. And we find that in terms of always reflecting good health and safety practice in the workplace, they are compliant. So a 2 for the one indicator and 3 for the other. Again, looking at the same leading indicator, we're looking at the level of commitment here. So in this case, for that first indicator, we are saying that we rate that a 2, which shows that it would take probably 1 to 2 months to change that particular aspect. The second, relative to the second item, the level of commitment, management says would take 6 months about, so that we would rate as a 3. So we can calculate the climate maturity level then for demonstrating management commitment and involvement by looking at all 6 of the various items. I've only looked at 2. And we then can calculate that by looking at the mean of the sum of the maturity levels of the 6 items of each of them, multiplied by the sum of the levels of commitment. So that would tell you where the company rates in terms of demonstrating management commitment and involvement. And we can then write up a report. So, and in conclusion, I argue, and I hope that some of you agree with me, that health and safety in the workplace in uncertain times should be on the basis of better practice rather than compliance. And our favorite leader said, man must follow the dictates of their conscience, irrespective of the consequences which might overtake them for it. And I thank you for participating, and I hand you over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that presentation today. So if anyone, if you enjoyed this session and you want to find out more, or perhaps you want to host a similar session that's maybe customized for your own organization, you can contact either Cindy Swell or Venosha, and their contact details are on the screen at the moment. Also, if you want to find out more about the courses that we offer that are open to the public and you want to register for them, you can also contact them. I do have a lot of questions and comments that have come through, but just before I start that, and while I'm reading them out, I'm going to launch our final poll where you're able to rate the session today. So let me just go to some of the questions. When you were talking about that generic file, Prof, Scribante Labor has asked, with regards to purchasing a generic OHS file, can we purchase the file but customize the file to meet our needs for a particular site?
I think if you are desperate enough, then I would not say no. However, I'm always a firm believer that if you actually engaged and understood what you were doing and you did it yourself, even though it might not necessarily be perfect, but at least you would understand the process and why you are basically compiling that particular file. And it has to be specific to your particular workplace, your particular site, your particular project. So yes, hesitantly, if the intention is as was stated by the questioner.
Okay, thank you. So if anyone else has any other questions, you're welcome to either type them in the Q&A box, or you are able to raise your hand and ask your question live. I have a question from Reggie. So globally, the biggest challenge is talking or communicating with the respirator. I think it's like the masks and all that. Currently, employees are removing their protection to talk. Are there any solutions to this challenge?
I think that one can't use or rely on one of those interventions independent of the others. So I would argue that if you maintained a physical distance between yourselves of 2 meters, then I think it is advisable for that person, or it's fine for that person to remove their mask, but you retain your own. But the physical distance is absolutely important in that case. So the person would have to speak much louder, obviously.
Okay, thanks. I just got a question from Anton. He's asked if you can have your email address. We can forward that to you. Maybe even if you contact one of the ladies and they'll forward that to you, I think that'll be better because it hasn't got your email address on this comment. It's just your name. Then
Sarah,
I
suggest that maybe you handle that from your side.
Yeah, that'll be fine. If you email either myself when you respond to the mailer that goes out this afternoon, there's an option to provide feedback. That feedback comes to me. If you need Prof's contact details, you can email me there as well. Scribante Labor also had another question while you were doing your presentation. When you were discussing the compliance coordinator, the question is, should this not be a compliance manager and not coordinator as outlined in the latest directive released on the 1st of October? Is that a specific wording?
I don't think that's an issue. I think what is important is the role of that particular person and where that person sits in the hierarchy of the organizational structure, because it's a very important role. And as long as the function is performed, I don't care whether the person is called a director or whatever. It doesn't matter.
Okay, thanks. Another question from that same audience member. Wouldn't the worker with the asthma wearing a cloth mask have been addressed in our risk assessment?
It could have been. In the case of the person I was actually speaking to, who actually raised the issue with me, it wasn't. They were also not allowed to work from home, and in terms of this particular person, there was every possibility that they could have performed their function adequately well. They had to come to work, but the employer would not consider providing an alternative and basically placed it in the made the worker responsible for making that adjustment, even though there was a medical certificate which stated the need for the employer to do something.
Okay, thanks, Prof. I have another question from Aaron. Thank you for the insightful presentation. What is the best practice way of monitoring and raising an issue of non-compliance with an external contractor?
An interesting question. As I said before, minimum compliance would be, the lack of compliance or non-compliance or non-conformity with regulations is a minimum. And one would need to point that out to the external contractor that, we are asking you to actually do the absolute minimum and convince them to take that step before encouraging them to go above and beyond.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Joseph also has a question with regards to the masks with the asthmatics, and what masks, in your opinion, are recommended for asthmatics?
I think at least the N95, which is at this point in time reserved for medical and emergency workers only, hence the instruction for us to rather use cloth masks because of the global shortage of those specialist masks. In that case, I would, and if the worker is able to work from home, I would suggest that better practice would be to actually allow the person to do that, to limit the health issues that the person was experiencing.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Aaron also asked, is this presentation available for download? We will be sending out the presentation with the email that goes out this afternoon with the link to the website. So you will have access to the presentation. I did notice in some parts it was a bit fuzzy with the connection, so you'll definitely be able to get access to the presentation. Reggie says, thanks for a great topic. Then I've got a question. Oh, I can't read this name. Machi Tele. Tele, is the facility maintenance manager of the organization responsible for the contractor's behavior on site after both manager and contractor has signed the health and safety compliance necessary documents?
I'm not sure that I understand that particular question.
So is the facility or maintenance manager of the organization responsible for the contractor's behavior on site after both the manager and the contractor have signed a health and safety compliance document? So whose responsibility is it, the manager of the organization or the contractor? Who's liable for ensuring health and safety?
The manager. In fact, everybody would be responsible. In this particular case, I would say the manager, but also bearing in mind compliance or non-compliance, the workplace must be one that does not threaten the health and safety of occupants, general public, and workers. So whoever has the authority to be able to enforce that should do so.
Thank you. Joseph also says, thank you, Prof, much appreciated. And then Nkoleko says, thanks for a great presentation. That's all the questions we have at the moment, but you have a few more minutes. If you do want to ask any questions, you can either raise your hand or you can type a question in. And if you could just share the next slide, Prof, and everyone can see the details of the next webinar for next month. So we'll be hosting a webinar on the 10th of November, also on a Tuesday at 10 o'clock, and the topic will be the role of coaching and leadership. And this session will be facilitated by Julie Elliott and Liz Witherspoon. And if you had attended some of our earlier webinars, you would have seen some that they had done, I think it was about in May. Okay, so I don't see any other questions at the moment. If anyone does have another question that they only think of after the webinar, you're welcome to then include that in the feedback section and the mailer that goes out this afternoon. Otherwise, I'd firstly like to thank you, Prof, for sharing with us today and obviously giving us a bit of a teaser into what you'll be covering in the full courses that we have available at Extended Learning. Also, thank you to our attendees for joining us today and engaging in the webinar. So Prof Hoff will be facilitating our upcoming Safety, Health and Environment Management Training Program, and this is starting on the 27th of October. So if you would like to find out more about this program, or if you would like to register to attend, you can visit our website at www.ukznextendedlearning.com. And if you'd like to find out more about the construction courses that Prof will be facilitating, you can also take a look at our website for details on these. Otherwise, we hope you enjoyed the session today. Stay safe and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.